The war's final months were quieter than expected, but paperwork moved faster than armies. Long before victory parades or homecomings could be imagined, the end of the Second World War was already taking shape in memoranda, circulars, and planning tables. For West African soldiers still scattered across continents, the first stage of demobilization began not with a journey home, but with decisions made far away, in offices where the war was being measured in numbers rather than lives. By 1944, British officials were already looking beyond the battlefield. The scale of wartime mobilization had stretched imperial resources to the limit, and the assumption in London was clear. Once the fighting ended, forces raised for emergency purposes would be reduced as quickly as possible. The war had required expansion, peace would demand contraction. This outlook shaped every early discussion about demobilization, long before the last shots were fired. The British War Office moved first. On 14 January 1944, revised guidance was issued outlining how post-war demobilization should be organized across the empire. The document set out principles rather than detailed solutions. Colonial forces, including the Royal West African Frontier Force, were to be reduced in line with future defense needs, not wartime strength. Manpower ceilings were calculated, and any personnel above those limits were classified as surplus. The emphasis was on order, speed, and administrative clarity. In theory, the system appeared logical. Units would be reduced in stages. Soldiers would be released according to service category, length of enlistment, age, and operational necessity. Those deemed essential for occupation duties or ongoing security tasks would remain temporarily. The rest would be discharged when transport and facilities allowed. On paper, the process promised fairness through standard rules and clear categories. Yet beneath this neat structure lay a deeper imbalance. The system was designed around metropolitan priorities, how quickly Britain could shed its wartime army and redirect money and resources toward domestic recovery. Little attention was given to what mass demobilization would mean in colonies whose economies had been reshaped by years of recruitment, labor demands, and disrupted trade. The needs of the imperial center came first. Colonial consequences were treated as secondary problems to be managed later. Colonial administrations were expected to absorb those consequences. In West Africa, governors and senior officials began compiling their own estimates and forecasts. They reported how many men had been recruited, how many were likely to return within short periods, and where those men would re-enter civilian life. These reports painted a cautious picture. Wartime recruitment had drawn heavily from rural districts, removing young men from farms and villages for years at a time. Agriculture had survived, but often through increased labor by women, older men and children. Urban centers, meanwhile, had expanded unevenly. Cities such as Accra, Lagos, and Freetown had grown under wartime demand for dock labor, transport work, and services linked to military supply. Housing had not kept pace. Food prices had risen. Colonial officials warned that demobilization would release large numbers of trained but unemployed men into towns already under strain. Jobs would be scarce, and expectations would be high. These warnings were acknowledged, but rarely translated into policy. In London, demobilization planning remained focused on military efficiency rather than social reintegration. The end of the war was framed as an administrative problem with a clear solution: reduce numbers, close units, and cut costs. Longer-term concerns about employment, housing, and social stability were noted, but postponed. Responsibility for managing these issues was quietly shifted to colonial governments with limited budgets and authority. The absence of long-term planning for veteran welfare was striking. By 1944, in Britain, public debate was already underway about pensions, retraining schemes, and housing programs for returning servicemen. These discussions reflected the political weight of veterans at home and fears of post-war unrest. In West Africa, no comparable planning took place at the same scale. War gratuities and deferred pay were acknowledged, but broader questions, steady employment, social adjustment, psychological strain were left vague or undefined. The prevailing assumption was simple and deeply flawed. African soldiers would return to civilian lives much like those they had left behind. This belief ignored the scale of wartime change. Many soldiers had spent years away from their homes. Some had traveled across continents, lived in large cities, and worked with machinery, vehicles, and administrative systems previously unknown. The idea that they would quietly return to pre-war conditions underestimated how service itself had altered outlooks and expectations. This disconnect did not arise from a single decision, but from institutional habits. The War Office and the Colonial Office operated in parallel, each focused on its own responsibilities. Military planners prioritized speed, order, and cost reduction. Colonial officials were tasked with managing the social aftermath using limited staff and funds. Coordination between the two was uneven. Reports from West Africa warning about housing shortages, labor competition, and rising political awareness often arrived too late to influence policies already fixed in London. As victory in Europe approached in early 1945, demobilization plans hardened into schedules. Categories were finalized, release quotas were set. Depots were identified where soldiers would be processed and discharged. West African units were assessed not in terms of what they had endured, but in terms of how quickly they could be reduced without weakening imperial security elsewhere. Those still needed for overseas commitments or occupation duties would wait. The rest would be released when shipping and transport are allowed. Even at this stage, signs of future tension were visible. Soldiers who had served abroad had encountered different worlds, industrial cities, organized labor, and wartime rhetoric about rights, sacrifice, and freedom. Colonial administrators privately acknowledged that many would return with altered expectations about work, authority, and fairness. Yet the demobilization system made no provision for this shift. It assumed compliance, patience, and a smooth return to existing social hierarchies. By the spring of 1945, the plan was in full force. Files were prepared, release procedures were written, manpower targets were fixed. From an administrative perspective, demobilization appeared ready. What remained untested was whether a system designed to manage numbers could handle a human transition on this scale. The war's end was approaching rapidly, but for West Africa, the most challenging phase had yet to begin. Demobilization would soon move from paper to practice, exposing the gap between imperial planning and lived experience. The ending had been carefully organized, but its consequences were far less certain. Demobilization ran on forms, stamps, and waiting lines. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the release of West African soldiers did not arrive as a single sweeping moment. Victory did not dissolve the army overnight. Instead, it activated a system that had been designed months earlier, one that treated demobilization as a logistical task to be processed, measured, and cleared in stages. Across British West Africa, reception and discharge depots were opened or expanded to handle the expected flow of returning soldiers. These sites became the main gateways between military service and civilian life. Men arriving from overseas were first routed through ports, then transferred to railheads and camps inland. For many, this was their first step on African soil in years, yet it was not a homecoming. It was another phase of military administration. Each soldier entered a fixed sequence of checks that defined the machinery of demobilization. Identity had to be confirmed through service numbers and records. Units verified the length of service and theater of deployment. Medical officers carried out brief examinations to determine fitness for discharge. Weapons, uniforms, and equipment were collected and recorded. Pay accounts were reviewed, deductions noted, and discharge certificates prepared. Every step required paperwork, and every missing detail could slow the process. Release was governed by classification groups. Soldiers were not discharged simply because the war had ended, but according to categories shaped by policy decisions made far from West Africa. Length of service mattered, as did unit type and perceived future usefulness. Men considered surplus to post-war requirements were placed in early release groups. Others were retained for garrison duties, administrative roles, or delayed redeployment. For those waiting, the lack of clear timelines created long periods of uncertainty. Medical checks were among the first hurdles. These examinations were practical and limited in scope. Their purpose was to decide whether a soldier was fit to be discharged, not to assess long-term health. Physical injuries were recorded, especially those affecting mobility or labor. Psychological strain, fatigue, anxiety, or disorientation after years of service rarely appeared in official notes. The system focused on clearance, not care. As demobilization accelerated in late 1945, administrative bottlenecks became unavoidable. Discharge depots were often crowded beyond their planned capacity. Transport delays meant that men cleared for release could not move on. Files moved slowly between offices, sometimes passing through several hands before approval was granted. Pay records compiled across different war zones were incomplete or inconsistent. A single missing document could keep a soldier waiting for weeks. For men who had spent years moving across continents under military orders, this sudden immobility was difficult to accept. Waiting became a defining experience of demobilization. Soldiers waited for papers, for pay, for transport, and for news. Days blurred into weeks. Military discipline relaxed, but civilian life had not yet begun. The camps became places of suspension, where men were neither fully soldiers nor fully civilians. Transport shortages worsened the situation. Troop ships returning from Asia and the Middle East did not arrive on fixed schedules, and many vessels were being reassigned or removed from service. Ports in West Africa were already under pressure as wartime traffic gave way to renewed commercial trade. Railways, expanded during the war to carry supplies, could not easily shift to mass passenger movement. The result was a backlog that spread from ports to inland depots. Some soldiers remained in camps long after they had technically been discharged. Food and basic accommodation were provided, but the purpose was absent. For men who had lived by routine and command, this idle waiting created frustration and unease. Demobilization, intended to reduce the size of the army, temporarily increased the number of men held in transitional spaces. Comparisons with British demobilization quickly circulated within camps. Soldiers shared information, often through rumours, newspapers, or returning officers. Many learned that British servicemen were being released more rapidly, with clearer guidance about post-war benefits and employment schemes. These comparisons did not always provoke anger, but they sharpened awareness of unequal treatment. The language of shared wartime sacrifice began to feel hollow when measured against different post-war outcomes. Colonial officials attempted to manage expectations. Notices were posted explaining procedures and urging patience. Officers reassured soldiers that delays were unavoidable and that all men would eventually be processed. The tone emphasized order and fairness, yet the system's impersonality was hard to ignore. Years of service were reduced to lines on a form, stamped and filed. For many soldiers, demobilization felt less like recognition and more like quiet dismissal. Release did not always mean immediate departure. Even after receiving discharge papers and pay, men often remained near depots while waiting for onward transport to their home regions. Military authority weakened, but civilian structures had not yet taken over. This in-between state became one of the most lasting memories of demobilization. It revealed how little planning had been done for the period between army and civilian life. By mid-1946, the machinery of demobilization was operating at full capacity. Thousands of West African soldiers were being released each month. On paper, the system succeeded. Numbers fell steadily, manpower targets were met, and units were disbanded. Administratively, demobilization looked efficient. Yet beneath these figures lay a widening gap between success on paper and experience on the ground. Demobilization achieved its immediate aim, the rapid reduction of wartime forces. What it did not ensure was a return in any meaningful sense. Release did not guarantee transport home, stable income, or reintegration into communities changed by years of war. As soldiers left the depots carrying certificates and modest pay packets, the machinery that had processed them fell silent behind them. Ahead lay a journey no longer managed by the army, shaped instead by limited transport, strained economies, and uncertain futures. The system that had brought them this far had little to say about what came next, and its limits were about to become clear. For many soldiers, the journey home took longer than the war itself. Demobilization did not end at the depot gate, nor did it conclude with the signing of discharge papers. Instead, it stretched outward across seas, rail lines, roads, and footpaths, turning return into a slow and uncertain process. The distance between military service and civilian life was measured not only in miles, but in waiting, fatigue, and growing unease about what lay ahead. Once discharged, West African soldiers entered a transport system still shaped by wartime strain. Troop ships that had carried men to distant fronts were now being reassigned, sold, or withdrawn from service. Shipping space was limited, and schedules were irregular. Men returning from Asia or the Middle East often waited weeks in transit ports, sometimes living in temporary camps while ships were diverted to other priorities. The war had ended, but the logistical pressure it created did not disappear overnight. Arrival at West African ports brought relief, but not resolution. Coastal cities were only the first stop. From there, soldiers still had to travel inland to towns and villages that could be hundreds of miles away. Railways, expanded during the war to move supplies and equipment, were not designed to carry large numbers of civilian passengers. Passenger carriages were few, freight trains took priority, and delays were common. Many veterans waited days or weeks near railheads, unsure when they would be able to continue their journey. Where rail lines ended, roads began, and often deteriorated. Wartime investment had improved certain routes, especially those linked to military supply, but vast areas of West Africa remained poorly connected. Lorries were scarce and costly. Soldiers used their gratuities to pay for transport when they could, but funds disappeared quickly. Others walked long distances, carrying kit bags, documents, and small personal items that represented years of service reduced to a handful of possessions. The physical effort of returning home underscored how thin the infrastructure of peace remained. By the time veterans reached their home regions, the places they returned to were often unfamiliar. Wartime recruitment had removed large numbers of young men from rural communities for extended periods. Agriculture had continued, but under altered conditions. Women and older men had taken on expanded roles in farming, trade, and household management. In some areas, cash crops had replaced subsistence farming in response to wartime demand and colonial purchasing schemes. Veterans returned not to paused lives, but to communities that had adapted in their absence. This shift created distance within families. Soldiers who had lived under military discipline, regular pay, and clear routines now encountered households shaped by scarcity, improvisation, and long separation. Expectations on both sides did not always align. Families often assumed that returning men would bring financial stability and authority. Veterans expected recognition, opportunity, and a measure of respect earned through service. When these hopes were not met quickly, disappointment settled in. The war had promised change, but demobilization delivered uncertainty. Social reintegration was further complicated by experience abroad. Many West African soldiers had been exposed to urban life, industrial work, and different racial relationships during service. They had seen British cities damaged by bombing, worked alongside soldiers from India, the Caribbean, and East Africa, and heard wartime language about freedom and sacrifice repeated in training camps and speeches. Returning to rigid colonial hierarchies and limited economic choices felt restrictive. Veterans were not uniformly politicized, but they were rarely unchanged. In towns and cities, the challenges took a different form. Urban centers such as Accra, Lagos, and Freetown had expanded during the war, drawing workers into docks, workshops, and services tied to military needs. With demobilization, many of these jobs disappeared or contracted. Veterans arriving in search of work encountered crowded labor markets, rising rents, and high food prices. The skills they had acquired, driving, mechanical repair, clerical tasks, were not always formally recognized or easily converted into civilian employment. Informal support networks began to form along these routes of return. Former soldiers sought one another out, sharing information on transport options, job leads, and temporary accommodation. Ex-servicemen's associations emerged, often starting as social groups or mutual aid circles. These networks provided practical help, but they also became spaces where shared frustrations were voiced. Stories of delayed pay, long journeys, and unmet promises circulated widely, reinforcing the sense that demobilization had been incomplete. The journey home itself became a topic of conversation and memory. Veterans compared routes, waiting times, and costs. Some spoke of months spent moving in stages, advancing only when transport became available. Others described walking for days between rail stops and villages. These experiences shaped how demobilization was understood, not as a clean transition, but as a drawn-out process marked by effort and uncertainty. As gratuities were spent on food, fares, and temporary shelter, financial pressure mounted. By the time many veterans finally settled, their funds were already diminished. The promise that demobilization pay would ease the return to civilian life felt increasingly fragile. The road home had consumed both time and resources, leaving little margin for rebuilding. Homecomings did not end the demobilization experience. They transformed it. The journey carried soldiers out of the army, but delivered them into new tensions, economic, social, and psychological, that would define the post-war years. Each stage of return revealed gaps between wartime mobilization and peacetime capacity. The state that had moved men across oceans struggled to reintegrate them into everyday life. As these pressures accumulated, the question shifted. It was no longer simply how the war had ended, but what its end now meant for those who had served. The long road home exposed the limits of planning and the cost of neglect. Demobilization had released soldiers from service, but it had not delivered them back into stability. What awaited them next would depend less on military orders than on the fragile balance of work, support, and recognition in the world they had returned to. Demobilization pay was calculated precisely and felt insufficient. For many West African veterans, the moment of discharge came with a careful accounting of service, reduced to figures on a page. Years spent away from home were translated into war gratuities, deferred wages, and a small set of future entitlements. On paper, the system appeared ordered and fair. In lived experience, it became one of the clearest points where wartime expectations collided with post-war reality. During the war, soldiers had been told that their service would be recognized financially. This assurance mattered. Military pay, though modest, had provided regular income, and the promise of a gratuity at the end of service helped justify long absences from home. The war gratuity was designed as a lump sum payment, calculated by length of service, rank, and enlistment category. Deferred pay, money held back during service, was added at discharge. Together, these sums were meant to help veterans restart civilian life. The formulas behind these payments were exact but rigid. Rank carried significant weight. Officers and senior non-commissioned officers qualified for higher gratuities and, in some cases, access to pension schemes. Ordinary soldiers received far less. Contract terms also mattered. Men enlisted for specific periods, or those who had served in labor and pioneer units, often fell outside long-term pension eligibility altogether. These distinctions reflected military structure, but in civilian life, they created sharp inequalities among men who had shared similar risks and hardships. Delays quickly undermined confidence in the system. Pay records had been assembled across multiple war zones, often under difficult conditions. Files were incomplete, figures did not always match, and clerks had to reconcile discrepancies before funds could be released. Some veterans received only partial payments at first. Others waited weeks or months for full settlement. For men already struggling with transport costs and rising prices, these delays deepened anxiety. Deductions added to the sense of grievance. Charges for lost equipment, advances taken during service, or administrative corrections reduced final payouts. In some cases, soldiers did not fully understand why amounts were lower than expected. Appeals were allowed, but the process was slow and difficult. It required navigating colonial offices, submitting written requests, and producing documents that many veterans did not have or could not easily replace. As news spread, comparisons with British veterans became unavoidable. Newspapers and returning servicemen carried reports of post-war benefits in Britain, housing assistance, retraining programs, family allowances, and clearer pension pathways. West African veterans increasingly understood that their own benefits were narrower and more conditional. The wartime language of shared sacrifice began to feel hollow when post-war rewards were so unevenly distributed. Colonial officials defended the system on economic grounds. Budgets were limited, and governments feared that large cash payouts could fuel inflation or disrupt fragile labor markets. Gratuities were framed as temporary assistance, not long-term support. Officials argued that colonial economies could not sustain broader welfare programs. These explanations may have reflected fiscal realities, but they did little to address the emotional impact on veterans who felt their service had been undervalued. The value of gratuities also fell quickly. Post-war inflation pushed up the cost of food, housing, and transport. What appeared on paper as a meaningful sum often proved inadequate in practice. Veterans spent money quickly on basic needs: fares home, family support, clothing, and tools. Some invested in small trade, farming equipment, or transport, hoping to build independent livelihoods. Others used their funds simply to recover from years of absence. Without steady employment or access to credit, gratuities were often exhausted within months. This financial strain carried broader consequences. Pay grievances became common topics in veteran gatherings and informal meetings. Men compared amounts, discussed deductions, and shared stories of delays. Petitions were drafted and letters sent to colonial authorities. In some cases, delegations were formed to demand explanations or revisions. Not all veterans took part, but compensation issues provided a shared language of disappointment that crossed regional and occupational lines. The issue of pay also sharpened political awareness. What began as individual frustration gradually took on collective meaning. Veterans questioned not only the size of their payments, but the principles behind them. Why did rank matter so much after the war? Why were colonial soldiers excluded from benefits extended elsewhere in the empire? These questions did not always lead to open protest, but they changed how veterans viewed colonial authority and obligation. By the late 1940s, the financial side of demobilization could no longer be separated from broader debates about fairness and recognition. Compensation was no longer seen simply as money owed, but as a measure of respect. Veterans did not necessarily expect identical treatment to that of British servicemen, but many believed their loyalty and service deserved greater recognition than they received. Economic pressure intensified these feelings. As gratuities ran out and employment remained uncertain, some felt disappointment harden into resentment. Pay grievances fed into labor disputes, union meetings and political discussions already shaped by rising prices and housing shortages. The line between personal hardship and public unrest became harder to draw. Demobilization had delivered release from service, but it had not delivered reassurance. The financial promises of wartime had been honored in form, but not in spirit. For many West African veterans, pay became the symbol of a larger failure, a system that could calculate service precisely, yet struggled to value it meaningfully once the war was over. Peace arrived faster than jobs. By the time large numbers of West African veterans completed their journeys home, the wartime economy that had absorbed labor on an unprecedented scale was already contracting. Demobilization released men into civilian life at a pace that local labor markets could not match, turning employment into the central struggle of the post-war years. During the war, military demand had reshaped work across West Africa. Ports, railways, workshops and supply depots expanded to meet Allied needs. Uniformed service offered steady pay, regular meals, and a clear routine. Even men assigned to labor and pioneer units knew where they would work and when they would be paid. Demobilization brought an abrupt end to that certainty. Military contracts were cancelled, construction slowed, and public works were reduced as colonial governments tried to cut spending and rebalance budgets. Veterans entered civilian labor markets already under strain. Civilians who had remained at home during the war also faced underemployment and rising living costs. Demobilized soldiers now competed for the same limited opportunities, often without formal qualifications recognized by civilian employers. Skills learned in the army, driving lorries, maintaining engines, keeping records, organizing men, did not always translate neatly into civilian job categories. Experience counted for less than access and connections. Vocational retraining schemes were discussed as a solution, but their reach was limited. Some colonial administrations offered short courses in trades such as carpentry, mechanics or clerical work, often based on British models. In practice, these programs had few places and limited equipment. Instruction periods were brief, and certificates carried uncertain value in competitive labor markets. Many veterans applied and were turned away. Others completed training only to find that jobs were still scarce. Urban centers became the main focus of veteran job searches. Cities such as Accra, Lagos, and Freetown had grown rapidly during the war, drawing migrants with the promise of wages and opportunity. After demobilization, these same cities struggled to absorb returning soldiers. Housing shortages drove rents upward, forcing many veterans into overcrowded quarters or informal settlements. Food prices remained high, and casual labor offered irregular income. Daily survival replaced long-term planning. Competition for work strained relations between veterans and civilians. Employers could choose among many applicants, often favoring those willing to accept lower wages. Veterans who expected their service to carry weight were disappointed. The sense of shared hardship that had existed during wartime eroded in the face of post-war scarcity. For some, frustration turned inward. For others, it sought expression through collective action. Colonial labor policies offered little relief. Governments feared that widespread veteran unemployment could destabilize public order, yet they were reluctant to intervene strongly in labor markets. Efforts to direct demobilized soldiers back into agriculture met resistance. After years of military pay and exposure to urban life, many veterans were unwilling to return to subsistence farming under colonial constraints. Land access was uneven, tools were costly, and agricultural prices were uncertain. The war had raised expectations that rural life could no longer meet. Trade unions and labor movements provided an alternative outlet. Veterans brought organizational skills learned during service, discipline, coordination, and confidence. In docks, railways, and municipal services, ex-servicemen emerged as organizers, stewards, and spokesmen. Their presence did not dominate these movements, but it strengthened them. Labor disputes in the late 1940s increasingly reflected veteran participation, linking employment grievances to broader demands for wages, housing, and reform. Colonial authorities watched these developments closely. Official reports noted the growing visibility of ex-servicemen in strikes and protests, sometimes describing them as potential troublemakers. Surveillance increased, and meetings were occasionally restricted or monitored. Yet officials also recognized the limits of repression. Employment shortages could not be solved by policing alone. The underlying problem remained structural. Demobilization had produced a large pool of trained men, but civilian economies lacked the capacity or willingness to absorb them. Not all veterans shared the same fate. Some secured stable work, particularly those with technical skills, literacy, or personal connections. Drivers found positions in transport companies, clerks entered government service, mechanics opened small workshops, others returned to farming or trade with moderate success. Demobilization produced varied outcomes, shaped by region, education, and timing. Still, the pattern of underemployment was widespread enough to influence public discussion and collective memory. For many veterans, work became the measure by which demobilization was judged. Military service had promised advancement, or at least stability. Peace offered neither reliably. The contrast between wartime mobilization and post-war neglect sharpened awareness of inequality and limited opportunity. Employment was no longer just a personal need, it became a symbol of recognition and belonging. As the decade progressed, frustration over work fed into broader social tension, joblessness intersected with rising prices, housing shortages, and political uncertainty. Veterans were not the sole actors in these struggles, but their experiences gave them a distinct voice. They understood organization, discipline, and collective pressure, and these skills carried over into civilian disputes. The battlefield had shifted. It was no longer defined by distant fronts or military orders, but by daily efforts to secure wages, shelter, and dignity. For many West African veterans, the struggle for work became the longest campaign they would fight. Demobilization had ended their service, but it had not delivered security. Instead, it placed them in a contest shaped by scarcity and uneven power, one that would influence labor relations and political life in the years to come. Military service reshaped expectations of citizenship. For many West African veterans, the years spent in uniform did more than interrupt civilian life. They altered how authority, rights, and obligation were understood. Demobilization returned men to colonial societies that demanded obedience without offering recognition, and that imbalance sharpened political awareness in ways few planners had anticipated. During the war, West African soldiers had moved through a wider world than most had known before. They encountered other colonial troops from East Africa, India, and the Caribbean. They worked alongside British units and saw European civilians living under rationing, bombing, and loss. Training manuals spoke of duty and shared sacrifice. Official speeches framed the conflict as a struggle for freedom and justice. Even when these ideas were applied unevenly, they left an impression. Service suggested that contribution mattered, and that it should carry consequences after the war. On returning home, many veterans measured civilian life against those wartime promises. The contrast was sharp. They found limited employment, delayed pay, and administrative indifference. Requests for assistance were often met with form letters or silence. This gap between expectation and reality did not produce instant protest, but it encouraged questioning. Veterans began to ask why loyalty during war translated into neglect during peace. At first, this awareness appeared in restrained forms. Veterans wrote letters to colonial offices seeking clarification on pay, pensions, or jobs. Petitions were submitted through official channels, carefully worded and respectful in tone. Appeals for employment assistance often referenced service records and medals, as if proof of sacrifice might still carry weight. When replies were slow, dismissive, or negative, frustration deepened. The process itself taught veterans how little leverage individual service now held. Ex-servicemen's associations became important spaces during this period. Many began as informal groups, meeting to share news, provide small loans, or help members navigate bureaucracy. Over time, these gatherings took on a wider role. Discussions expanded beyond individual grievances to broader questions of fairness, opportunity, and respect. The discipline learned in the army shaped these meetings. They were often orderly, structured, and focused, reflecting habits formed during service. These associations did not operate as unified political movements, but they created networks. Veterans exchanged information about labor disputes, rising prices, and public meetings. They compared treatment across regions and colonies. The shared experience of demobilization, waiting, disappointment, and adjustment gave these conversations a common foundation. Political awareness grew not from ideology alone, but from repeated encounters with inequality. In the Gold Coast, this process became increasingly visible by the late 1940s. Economic pressure was already mounting. Prices for food and housing rose, while wages lagged behind. Urban unemployment increased. Veterans were not the sole drivers of unrest, but they were present in growing numbers. Their service records lent credibility to complaints that might otherwise have been dismissed. When ex-servicemen spoke, they did so as men who had already proven their loyalty to the empire. The events of February 1948 in Accra revealed this convergence. Demonstrations over economic conditions drew wide participation, including ex-servicemen. Their presence mattered symbolically. Men who had worn imperial uniforms were now standing among civilians, openly questioning post-war obligations. The response was forceful, and the disturbances were suppressed. Yet the moment marked a turning point. Demobilization grievances had moved from offices and associations into public space. Colonial governments responded with caution and increased monitoring. Reports tracked veteran activity in labor unions, political groups, and informal networks. Officials were careful not to exaggerate the threat, but were uneasy about ignoring it. Veterans occupied an uncertain position. They were respected for service, yet feared for their potential influence. The army had trained them in organization and discipline. Demobilization had released them without removing those skills. In Nigeria, similar patterns appeared, shaped by local conditions. Rapid urban growth created new political organizations and labor movements. Veterans joined these spaces as individuals, rather than as a single bloc. Their wartime exposure to global ideas, however limited or fragmented, contributed to a growing sense that colonial rule was not fixed or permanent. Service abroad had shown that power could be contested, negotiated, and changed. It is important to recognize the limits of this awakening. Veterans were not uniformly politicized. Many focused on personal survival, family responsibilities, and steady work. Some remained loyal to colonial authority, believing reform could come gradually. Others disengaged entirely, worn down by disappointment. The political impact of demobilization was uneven, varying by region, occupation, and personal circumstance. Yet even where veterans avoided open activism, expectations had shifted. Military service had demonstrated the ability of colonial subjects to organize, endure hardship, and contribute to global outcomes. The post-war settlement offered few ways to acknowledge that capacity. As a result, veterans became part of a wider questioning of colonial legitimacy, less through slogans than through lived contradiction between the service rendered and the rewards received. By the late 1940s, the connection between demobilization and politics was increasingly clear. Welfare disputes merged with labor activism, and labor activism fed into constitutional debate. Veterans stood at this intersection, not as leaders of every movement, but as visible reminders of promises made during war and delayed in peace. Their presence gave weight to demands for reform and sharpened the moral argument behind them. Demobilization had released men from the army, but it had not returned them to political silence. The transition from soldier to citizen remained unfinished. As West Africa moved toward decolonization, the experiences of veterans lingered beneath the surface, shaping attitudes, expectations, and forms of protest. Demobilization ended on paper, not in life. By the early 1950s, the administrative task of releasing West African soldiers from service was essentially complete. Units had been disbanded, discharge depots had been closed, and files had been stored away in government offices. From an official viewpoint, the process was finished. Yet for many veterans, demobilization marked not a return to normal life, but the start of a long adjustment, whose effects continued long after the army withdrew. In practical terms, the outcomes of demobilization were uneven. Some former soldiers managed to build stable livelihoods. A few used skills learned during service, driving, mechanics, clerical work to secure employment in transport firms, workshops, or government offices. Others relied on networks formed during demobilization, drawing on contacts with fellow veterans or local leaders to find opportunities. These successes, however, were limited in number and often depended on access to education, capital, or urban connections rather than service alone. Many veterans remained underemployed. They moved between casual labor, small trade, and seasonal farming, earning just enough to survive. Without steady wages or credit, planning for the future proved difficult. Some returned to agriculture, but access to land was uneven and tools were expensive. Others settled in towns, where overcrowding, high rents, and irregular work shaped daily life. Military service, which had once provided structure and certainty, offered little protection against these realities. Colonial governments slowly recognized that demobilization had produced lasting social strain. Reports in the late 1940s and early 1950s acknowledged veteran hardship, urban congestion, and rising labor tension. Officials noted that wartime recruitment had removed men from civilian life faster than post-war systems could absorb them. Yet recognition did not always lead to action. Large-scale reforms, comprehensive pension schemes, expanded retraining programs, or coordinated employment plans were discussed more often than implemented. Part of the difficulty lay in how demobilization had been framed. From the beginning, it was treated as a temporary administrative problem rather than a long-term social transition. Once soldiers were released and paid, responsibility for their future quietly shifted to local economies and families. This approach underestimated the depth of change created by years of war. Demobilization solved the problem of surplus manpower, but it did not resolve questions of belonging, opportunity, or recognition. Public memory followed a similar path. Official accounts praised West African participation in the war in broad terms, highlighting loyalty and contribution. Parades, speeches, and commemorative events focused on service rather than on what followed. The demobilization experience itself, waiting, disappointment, and struggle, received little sustained attention. Veterans' difficulties were absorbed into general explanations about post-war adjustment and economic limits. Over time, this silence reduced visibility. Veterans became less distinct as a social group, even as their experiences continued to shape labor relations, urban life, and political expectations. Many spoke of their service within families and communities, but fewer saw their stories reflected in policy or public history. The gap between wartime rhetoric and post-war recognition narrowed slowly, if at all. As independence movements gained momentum in the 1950s, attention shifted toward constitutional change and national futures. Demobilization was increasingly framed as a prelude rather than a central chapter, yet it mattered precisely because it bridged these eras. The transition from empire at war to colonies seeking self-rule passed through the lives of returning soldiers. Their experiences linked military service to labor activism, welfare disputes to political organization, and personal disappointment to collective awareness. Demobilization did not cause decolonization, but it shaped the conditions under which demands for change were made. Veterans carried with them habits formed during service, discipline, organization, and a belief that contribution should be acknowledged. Some became union organizers, clerks, teachers, or community leaders. Others withdrew from public life, focused on family and survival. What they shared was an understanding that the end of the war had not delivered a clean break, but a gradual reckoning. By the time independence approached in much of West Africa, many veterans had already adapted to civilian life without formal recognition. They became workers, traders, farmers, and organizers, often blending military experience with local knowledge. Some remained politically active, others grew disillusioned and stepped back. Their paths differed, but their presence remained part of the social fabric shaped by the war's aftermath. Looking back, demobilization appears less as a conclusion than as a hinge. It closed one chapter of imperial mobilization while opening another defined by uncertainty, negotiation, and uneven change. The systems that released soldiers from service succeeded in reducing numbers efficiently. They struggled, however, to restore balance to lives altered by years of absence, discipline, and expectation. The war ended, and the empire moved on. Files were closed, budgets adjusted, and attention shifted elsewhere. But for those who returned to West Africa in the war's aftermath, demobilization remained an unfinished transition. It quietly and persistently reshaped lives, influencing work, politics, and memory long after the last discharge papers were signed. The end of the war marked not an ending, but the beginning of a slower, more uncertain journey, one whose effects reached far beyond the moment when peace was declared. These stories didn't end with the war, they shaped the world that followed. Like, subscribe, and share to keep these overlooked histories alive. Join the conversation and explore how the aftermath of war reshaped West Africa.